the most productive years between 1892 and 1902. The last 20 years of his life were very miserable and unhappy. After his visit to Bourke, Henry really, I think, blossomed as a prose writer, and he made a great impression. Within 2 years, his first book was published by his mother, short stories in verse and prose, and 2 years after that, Angus and Robertson published a collection of his verse in the days when the world was wide, and a collection of his prose, While the Billy Boils. The prose was extremely successful, and Lawson's reputation grew not only in Australia but abroad. And he actually had letters from English publishers expressing interest in his work. But even at that time, Lawson had married in 1896, but his life was never really steady. He went to Western Australia for a second time. He went to New Zealand for a second time. His life never quite settled down. He felt rather desperate about his future as a writer, and I think it's important to say that Henry was very ambitious as a writer. He wanted above all to succeed as a writer, and he found it very difficult in Australia. The payment was very poor, and he was encouraged by the letters he had from English publishers to think that if he got to England, he could establish himself as a writer. And he did a quite remarkable thing. He wrote to the Governor of New South Wales, Earl Beecham, and asked him for help. And the Governor did an even more remarkable thing. He invited Henry to Government House. I was just the other day reading Lawson's manuscript describing the visit to Government House, and I was telling John and David on the way out, one detail I found very affecting was Lawson said, "I sat very close to Earl Beecham because I'm a little deaf, and I had to sit very close to him so I could hear him. And we talked as man to man." Beecham enabled Lawson to go to England. He gave him £100, which was a large sum of money, and he supported Lawson during his years in England. The future looked very bright in 1900 when Lawson went to England, but he was ill-fated. His wife became very ill and was in a mental hospital for 6 months. He found everything growing increasingly difficult, and his work, of course, suffered all sorts of complications that I won't go into. He had in Joe Wilson and his mates, the first book of work he'd done in England, some of his very best work. But by 1902, when he was putting together his second book of work done in England, he wrote to the famous English critic, Edward Garnett, who was a great admirer of his and was helping him to get the book published. He said, this book, and he wanted to call it The Heart of Australia. When Lawson's first book had been published, the literary editor of the Bulletin said, Henry Lawson is the voice of the bush, and the bush is the heart of Australia. And Lawson wrote to Garnett and said, this book, it actually came out under a different title. It came out under the title Children of the Bush. I think the publisher must have decided that. This book centres on Bourke. If you know Bourke, you know Australia, which is a remark you know very well here. And a number of the stories were focused on Bourke, but it was a different view of Bourke. He was remembering not the harshness of the conditions he'd encountered, he was remembering the human kindness. He tended, if anything, to idealise what he'd experienced in Bourke in stories like Sin Round the Hat, or That Pretty Girl in the Army, and so on. He said in a prose piece called The Romance of the Swag, and I've carried my swag for months out back in Australia. And the only time he did that was up here. And it was life, in spite of its squalidness and meanness and wretchedness and hardship, and in spite of the fact that the world would have regarded us as tramps and a free life amongst men from all over the world. So he was, in memory, looking back to that as a time when he had something valuable that was lost. Now, Lawson's stay in England ended very unhappily. Back in Australia, he and his wife separated. He attempted suicide. I won't go into the miseries of his last 20 years, but he was a man struggling against the odds, struggling to keep going. Now, in the songs in the second part of the program, the emphasis is on the personal emotion. Lawson, more and more in his verse, wrote about his own personal situation. And there is a recurring theme. He was haunted by the sense of the man that he might have been, the work that he might have done, and also the love he might have had. And there are two, I think, rather haunting love poems which may give you an impression of Lawson that is new to you. He was a man who suffered greatly but struggled, and what I find very moving is that running through these verses is a thread which could be summed up as a belief in human kindness. He did rage in some of his poems. He did get angry and attack people. But when he thought about human nature, he wanted to believe the best in people. Now, the first song in the second half of the program is one written in 1896, a year when he got married, when he had the two books come out. It was a time of hope, and I think the poem expresses something absolutely fundamental to Lawson. It's summed up in the words of the song, "A good world after all." He wanted to believe that in spite of everything that went wrong, everything he suffered, he wanted to believe it was a good world after all. And here's John to sing the song.
Thank you, John.